As we learn from Tevye on the famous Fiddler on the Roof, we know that there are traditions. Tradition is rich in life, and most all of life has some kind of traditional activity, behavior that's based on originating sources and circumstances that have over the years developed and become part of our practice. We know that we learn things like that from our families, we get traditions from our communities, we get traditions from our schools and the places and organizations where we live and work, play. Judaism had many rich traditions that helped to define and explain and to shape behaviors and to formulate relationships between people in the community and people outside the community, and of course, even more spiritually grounded in a relationship with God. I remember a parishioner shared with me one time that growing up, she had watched every year as her mother prepared a ham for Easter, and she always cut the end off the ham. And so this particular woman and her sister, and later her brother, younger brother, every time they prepared a ham for Easter, which had become their tradition, they cut the end off. And they were all three at one point, much later as adults, visiting their mother, and she prepared Easter dinner, and she didn't cut the end off the ham. And one of the sisters asked, "Well, Mom, you always cut the end off. Why didn't you do it this time?" And she said, "Well, dear, back in those years when you were young, I didn't have a roasting pan big enough to hold the whole ham, so I cut the end off." Well, for the girls and their brother, it had become a tradition that was assumed to be essential to preparing the ham properly. So we can take things that have a logical basis and over the course of time lose the connection and go off in other directions. Judaism had a wonderful tradition, as any particular social structure, any rule system has got to have circumstances further explained. We need interpretation, we need commentary, as we know from our own legal system. We can't just simply have a law that states something generically. We have to look at specific applications, circumstances, what happened in this case. Does this apply? Does it not apply? How does it apply here? For instance, in the Ten Commandments, the commandment of keeping the Sabbath day holy. Well, what does that look like? What would be a violation of that? What constitutes obedience to that? If we want to live by it faithfully and piously, we need to have some explanations, and there are wonderful, rich sources of that that are part of the Hebrew tradition. This accumulation of insight, knowledge, learning from the scribes and from the religious leaders over the generations, particularly following the captivity of the Jewish people and taken into Babylon. They became more and more necessary to define what constituted Judaism, what was not faithful to Judaism, and how do those traditions then apply to various aspects of the Ten Commandments, the kind of the basis. And so in today's reading, we hear the religious leaders from Jerusalem. This is a particular group of leaders, and their advisors, the legal advisors, the scribes, the lawyers, have come and they've challenged Jesus as they observe some of Jesus' disciples not following a tradition, which is about the washing the hands and so on. And we certainly know today that washing hands and being careful about certain hygiene, personal hygiene habits, as well as sanitation habits, washing pots and pans, those are useful things, but certainly they're not essentials to salvation or relationship to God. However, the religious authorities of the day were seeking in some ways to discredit Jesus, and other ways to test whether or not he is faithful to the tradition as they understand it, to the faith as they embrace it and practice it. And the Pharisees were the most strict in adhering to the religious teachings that had been handed down. The trouble with traditions can be, however, that they become so automatic to us. They become so, for us, normative that we fail to see that they really are not essentials necessarily, but they are derivative from something, And what is the underlying thing from which it is derivative? Is there something underlying that? Jesus points out that the Jewish authorities that are challenging him on this issue are more eager to justify themselves based on observance of traditions rather than the spirit that underlies it, which is based in the law. He holds up the illustration of how to treat mothers and fathers. The Ten Commandments say that you shall honor your mother and father. Well, what does that look like? And the religious authorities could justify themselves in not necessarily supporting or providing financial assistance to elderly, needy parents, because you could say that you have devoted part of your resources to God, and therefore you no longer have the resources nor the responsibility, for that matter, to provide for your elderly parents. And Jesus said that's hypocrisy. That is totally deception. It is missing the whole point. That one has to be very careful always to examine what is the underlying principle. And Jesus points back to that the relationship that is important between humanity and God needs to be honored in its totality, not just simply in external observations. We know we're all guilty of it. We all can find ourselves divided over things that we do our way and they do differently. In the Christian tradition, I mean, just a simple example that divided the church, and it continues to divide the church, whether you crossed yourself this way or as the Eastern Orthodox with three fingers and going from right to left rather than left to right, handing over the heart, doing this or that, having your thumb over your right thumb over your left or your left over your right in certain periods of medieval history could lead to being put to death because you were seen as the other, the outsider, the heretic. And we therefore can use traditions to brutalize, to exclude, to marginalize, to beat up others. And we are blind to the bigger picture. We are so adapting our behavior and our understandings to this vision, thinking that's the right way, the only way, my way is the right way, everyone else is wrong, and therefore causing tremendous damage within the social structure and certainly to the kinds of relationship God wills for all of us. So tradition needs to be examined. We cannot take it for granted that what we do is necessarily totally the best behavior, the truly devout and holy behavior that God desires. That becomes a basis for justifying all kinds of violence and dangerous behavior towards others, as well as their behavior towards us, to divide the community and to set us apart. So my hope and prayer as we think about this text is that we will examine our own assumptions and behaviors, not making judgments of others before we have carefully examined what we take to be for granted the norm, making sure that it may be our norm, but it may not be the norm for all of the world. We need to look at and examine, what does God really call us to do? What does God desire of us based on our understandings of Jesus? How did he treat others? And then we hopefully will be willing to adjust or to live with our particular traditions with greater humility, honoring the fact that they are not the tradition, but a tradition. May God bless us and keep us and help us to be ever more responsive and compassionate to ourselves and to the needs of others.